Hanged in the Meadows, Godalming's chilling secret. In the first episode of the Godalming series, we uncover a dark, nearly forgotten piece of local history, a brutal double murder on the high street, a chilling execution on the Lammas Lands, and a wooden beam from the gallows, now hidden in plain sight. Join me as I walk through the streets where this all unfolded, and a church with a ghastly secret in its spire. This is the story of George Chennell Jr. and William Chalcraft. Murderers or misunderstood men? You decide.
On the morning of Tuesday, November 11th, 1817, a gruesome discovery was made in the quiet town of Godalming. At around 7:30 a.m, the lifeless bodies of Mr. George Chennell, a respected farm owner and shoemaker, and his long-time devoted housekeeper, Elizabeth Wilson, were found brutally murdered. Elizabeth was discovered on the kitchen floor, her throat savagely slashed, her head bludgeoned, and her hand nearly severed from her wrist. Mr. Chennell's body was found upstairs in his bed, with his skull fractured and his throat cut so deeply that he was nearly beheaded. While Mr. Chennell Sr. was well regarded in the community, his son, George Jr., was known for his troubled past. He lived at a farm on Charterhouse Road called Deanery Farm. It was a short walk from his father's shoemaker's shop, and he often visited his dad for meals due to no income. At 38 years old, George Jr. had a reputation as a troublemaker with dissolute habits. He had failed as a farmer, separated from his wife, and spent much of his time in local pubs, particularly the Richmond Arms, drinking away what little money he had or had stolen. His long-standing, strained relationship with both his father and the housekeeper, combined with his use of threatening language towards them, made him a prime suspect. Suspicion also fell on William Chalcraft, an older man who worked for George Chennell Sr. Despite having 6 children, often deserted his family and squandered his earnings on alcohol, with his drinking partner, George Jr. On the night of the murders, both George Jr. and Chalcraft were seen by several passing witnesses lurking in the alleyway adjacent to the Chennell home, placing them at the murder site. Police soon visited George Jr. house, and items belonging to the accused, stained with blood, were later found in a box under his bed. The pair were soon arrested and temporarily held together at Little George Hall. The trial had been postponed for close to a year from the previous assizes due to the illness of Sarah Hurst, who was a key witness. As a result, the 2 men spent nearly 9 months in Horsemonger Lane prison awaiting their fate. On the morning of Wednesday, August 12, 1818, the courtroom doors at Guildhall in Guildford's High Street opened promptly at 8 a.m. A mass of spectators flooded in, eager for a good view. Most were disappointed as the courtroom had limited space, causing a large crowd to gather outside for the rest of the long, hot summer day. Inside the packed courtroom it was just as hot, to the point the heat became unbearable. The judge, Mr. Sergeant Len, ordered the windows opened. Snatches of witness testimony floated out on the breeze to the large crowd standing outside, who responded with loud outbursts that often interrupted the court proceedings. The prosecution, led by Mr. Gurney, presented a compelling case. Witnesses testified to hearing screams and seeing the 2 men near the crime scene on the night of the murders. The most damning evidence came from Isaac Woods, the constable of Godalming, showing the murder weapons themselves, a shoemaker's hammer and a blood-stained knife. The hammer, sharp on one end and blunt on the other, had been used to inflict the fatal blows to the victims' heads. The knife was used for the deep slashes on both victims. It also appeared that the till in the shop had been broken open. 6 £1 notes and 15 silver coins were found in George Jr. pockets. 2 of the notes had visible blood stains, enough that anyone receiving them would immediately suspect foul play. Sarah Hurst, who was initially arrested late as an accomplice, testified for the prosecution, but not before Joseph Walker, keeper of the House of Correction at Kingston, had his say on the matter. He stated that Sarah was prone to fits and not suitable to give evidence. However, Mr. Woods, attorney for the prosecution, visited her in the House of Correction a while back and found her sane, as she was the key witness to both murders. She claimed that Chalcraft had asked her to keep watch outside the Chennell house while he and George Jr. went inside. She heard a scream and later saw blood on Chalcraft's smock frock. When pushed for more details, Sarah revealed a vital piece of information. Upon hearing the scream, she saw the two men rush out. When she asked Chalcraft what had happened, he replied, "We have done them both." She also saw blood on his sleeves by candlelight from an opposite window. When she asked how it got there, Chalcraft answered, "It is blood from them too." The following night at the Angel Inn, Chalcraft offered Sarah £4 to keep quiet. He spoke in whispers. She refused the money, saying she wanted nothing more to do with Chalcraft. Her testimony alone may have saved her from taking a third spot on the gallows. After a long and careful summing up by the judge, the jury deliberated for just 2 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty for both prisoners. Mr. Smith, Lord Ellenborough's crier, called for silence as the sentence of death was passed. Mr. Sergeant Lenz, placing the black coif, the emblem of death, upon his head, pronounced, "You, George Chennell, and you, William Chalcraft, be taken from the place on which you stand to the place from whence you came, and that on Friday next you be taken from thence to the place of execution, where you are to be severally hanged by the neck until you are dead, and that your bodies be given to be anatomized and dissected. And may the Lord have mercy on your souls." On August 14th, 1818, at 9 a.m., the under-sheriff arrived at the Guildford prison house. A caravan designed for executions was brought to the door. The prisoners were brought out with irons on their feet, ropes around their necks, and dressed for their final journey. Chennell wore a black jockey coat and waistcoat and brown pantaloons. Chalcraft wore a new smock frock. The executioner, with a drawn sword, sat in front, flanked by 2 armed turnkeys. The Reverend Mr. West sat with his back to the horses, Chalcraft on his right, Chennell on his left, as they proceeded to the hanging site. Immense crowds from Guildford, Godalming, and surrounding villages lined the roads, booing and shouting at the caravan. In narrow places, the crowds were pressed dangerously close to the horses. Every height and open space along the route was filled with onlookers, many of them farm servants in white straw hats and smock frocks. Throughout the journey, the prisoners remained attentive to the clergyman, but still refused to confess. The procession arrived at the place of execution around 11 a.m. The gallows stood in an open meadow we now know as the Lammas Lands. A rope barrier encircled the platform, allowing only the caravan and officers inside. Chalcraft appeared shaken. He urged Chennell to confess if guilty, but no confession was made. As the caravan stopped beneath the gallows, the Reverend Mr. Mann asked again, "Do you have anything to communicate?" Both replied simply, "No." Chennell was brought to the platform first. Standing firm and upright, he requested that the hood be pulled over his face to shield him from the watching crowd. Chalcraft, trembling, nearly required assistance to mount the platform. With no further words, the platform was drawn away. They were launched into eternity. Chennell convulsed violently. Chalcraft died almost instantly with a loud snap of the neck. The executioner soon ended Chennell's suffering by pulling hard on his legs. After hanging for an hour, their bodies were cut down and handed over to 2 local surgeons, Mr. Parson and Mr. Harris, for dissection. The place of execution was within sight of Chennell's family farm, not more than a gunshot from his father's house. Before the surgeons carried out the dissections, the bodies were paraded slowly through the town, escorted by police and prison officers, followed by crowds of townsfolk. When they reached Mr. Chennell's house on the High Street, the bodies were carried inside and laid on the kitchen floor where Elizabeth Wilson had been murdered. The dissections were then performed, and the bodies were displayed in the shoe shop windows for the public to see. Thousands eagerly filed through to gaze at the executed men, a gruesome public warning to any would-be murderers. The case of George Chennell Jr. and William Chalcraft remains one of the most notorious in local history, not only for its brutality, but for the lingering doubts about the guilt of the accused. The possibility that 2 innocent men were hanged continues to fuel arguments against the return of capital punishment. And that's not all. Remember I said at the start about the church? The beam from the gallows was later used as a rafter in the church spire. During restoration work it was exposed. A rubbing of the inscription now hangs in the ringing chamber, a gruesome reminder of the last public hanging carried out in Surrey. What happened to the bodies after I hear you ask? The bodies were collected and then subsequently buried outside the old churchyard wall on the southeastern edge side of St. Peter and St. Paul churchyard, less than a few hundred metres from the hanging site. It is unclear why the beam from the gallows, the one used in the execution of Chennell and Chalcraft, was placed in the church spire. What's your thoughts on this?
Coming up in the next episode of the Godalming Series. The woman who fooled the king, shocked the royal court and made herself briefly famous across England. Join me as I trace the steps of Mary Toft, who pulled off one of the most outrageous hoaxes in British medical history.